Good afternoon, everybody. We're so glad that you could join us for another month of SSDVE Presents. We'll take just another moment or so to let people get in from the Zoom link and get settled. If this is your first SSDVE session or monthly meeting, we do invite you to check out all of the resources and links and some more information about our featured speakers in the shared notes doc. There is a tiny URL on the screen, and my colleague, I believe, has already dropped the full link into the chat window if you'd like to click it or copy and paste that into your browser window as well. But we'll get started in just a moment. All right, it looks like folks are still kind of trickling in from the Zoom waiting room, if you will, the Zoom universe. But we will go ahead and get started. Again, our shared notes doc is linked in the chat window if you'd like to follow along or access some of the resources and materials. We are so appreciative of our guest speakers today. If you've been joining us the past few months, you'll recognize some friendly faces. We have Dr. Sean Smith, all the way from Kansas on the line with us. And we also have Dr. David Bateman. But joining us for this month's session, we have Dr. Eric Rossen, who's joining us from Maryland. So we're kind of all over the map this month, if you will, for our SSDVE session. I don't want to cut into their time. They've got a lot of great things that they'd like to share with you this month. We were just talking amongst ourselves about it's been a crazy, well, we know it's been kind of a crazy year to live in. And even over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of unknowns and some things happening locally, not just with school, but within us being real life human beings. So I think that you'll find what Dr. Rossen, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Bateman have to share with you today, hopefully uplifting and encouraging and useful both inside the school environment, whether that's in person or virtual, and just out in the real world. So without further ado, Eric, I'll turn it over to you. You should have the ability to screen share and we can hop right into things.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Ethan, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this pantheon of presenters with Dr. Smith and Dr. Bateman. So my goal today is to kind of just give you an update about what we really need to know about trauma right now. I'm not going to, obviously with a short amount of time, I'm not going to get into all the research, but I want to touch on a few things that I think are particularly relevant. So first, I always like to talk about what happens during an acute experience of stress. So think about this picture as an example about what happens in a normal circumstance, how we process the events in our lives, how we quickly appraise events that we experience. We observe it, we take that input, we process it, we evaluate it. This happens within microseconds. Now, when there's some acute stress, what happens to us physiologically is somewhat remarkable. We have adrenaline and cortisol that flows through our bloodstream. Our heart rate increases, sometimes 3 times as quick. Our large muscles of our bodies, dilate. And so that enables our gross motor actions like running and fighting. And the vessels in our organs and smaller muscles constrict. And that causes us to lose some of our fine motor control. Our prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for our executive functioning, that receives a lot less blood flow, and that's usually a big blood guzzler. So goodbye reasoning, goodbye planning, goodbye working memory, goodbye inhibition, goodbye impulse control. So in essence, we become fast, strong, and dumb. And that's typically what happens physiologically when we have a stress response that is triggered by one reason or another. Now, what's particularly alarming, either now amidst COVID or just generally, is that for many students that are experiencing ongoing and chronic stress or repeated stress, when that stress response is triggered over and over, that tends to become a default pathway to respond to anything that is perceived as stressful or threatening. And even our ability to correctly appraise situations starts to change. And so what we might be seeing over time is that with this kind of chronic, even low-grade chronic stress, this alarm, this stress response, this express route, this alarm system is more likely to be triggered in the future. So I always think it's important when we talk about trauma, when we use the word trauma, that we're all starting from the same place and identifying it in the same way. So what is trauma? So SAMHSA defines trauma with these 3 key principles. They put it in one sentence, but I break it out into these 3 bullets to help us unpack it a little bit. So the first is that they say it's an event or an experience. And the italics here are my own emphasis. So an event or an experience, and that's because not everything originates from some objectively catastrophic event. Sometimes it's an unknown, imperceptible experience. It could be something that's occurring over years, this low-grade chronic stress. The second bullet is it's one that an individual interprets or perceives as threatening or harmful to their well-being. And again, this is important because 2 kids might experience the same thing and have very different outcomes based on a range of things, including their own appraisal of the situation. So how did they interpret the environment? How did they perceive what happened? How did they appraise it? And then lastly, has to cause some kind of functional impairment. There was a study on community violence that looked at objective measures of community violence and then asked a bunch of adolescents whether they felt the community was violent. And guess which one was more predictive of outcomes for those students? It was whether they felt the community was violent. It didn't matter if a researcher came in and had numbers to report. If they felt their community was violent, if they perceived their environment as violent and threatening and dangerous, they had worse outcomes. So I think an important piece that I hope you take away is that trauma is subjective. This makes it somewhat more challenging for us as adults because it's so much easier to say, well, we know this event happened, these students are going to be traumatized, but that's just not true. So it's not an adult's job to determine what's traumatic for a child or an adolescent. It's our job to be responsive to it. But again, trauma refers to the subjective response to a set of conditions or experiences in a student's life. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about ACEs. This is, in fact, the only time I talk about ACEs here. And I'm guessing many of you are familiar with the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. The reason I share this with you, especially in the context now, is that the ACEs study was extremely incomplete. So it really only looked at these household issues: incarcerated family member, divorce, parental mental illness, substance abuse in the home, neglect. So but the other piece is that there's some other community variables that were not captured in that: historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, violence, substandard schools, substandard wages, racism, social injustice, poor housing quality, as well as other climate components. So, you know, the other thing is that it didn't even account for what are sometimes referred to as microaggressive traumas. So these are things that might even happen at school, right? So LGBTQI2S invisibility in sex education would not be classified as a trauma by most technical definitions, yet over time it can easily lead to clinical symptoms of trauma. Discrimination shows that it can lead to symptoms of trauma independently when you run a regression controlling for all these other variables. So the ACEs study really didn't give us a complete picture about the potential factors that influence an individual response to what happens to them. So right now, knowing what we know about the stress response, the likelihood that chronic stress increases the likelihood of triggering a stress response, and that there's this chronic and potentially layered adversity, our work has just a raised sense of urgency right now. So I'm thinking about the context and what we need to know now. So there was a recent report, journal article that came out in Pediatrics. This was put out just last month. And they asked parents, and they all reported that their worse mental health among adults, worse mental health among their children. So they reported 14% of them reported worsening mental health among their children. And I will say this about that second bullet. That's likely an underestimate. Time and time again in research, when parents are asked to report on their own child's stress and they ask children to verify that, parents regularly underreport and underestimate the amount of stress kids are under. And as a parent, that's a hard pill to swallow. I'm a parent myself, but it makes sense, right? A lot of kids are not going to their parent about all their stressors in their lives. They're going to their peers, they're keeping it to themselves, they may be talking to an adult at school. So 14% reported worsening mental health among their own children. I'm guessing it's higher than that. So we're seeing higher amounts of stress. We know that even parental mental wellness has an impact on student stress. We know stress is contagious. When even if something didn't happen to a student, but things are happening to their friends, their loved ones, their family, that can cause symptoms that align with trauma. We also know that during COVID, there's a potential for a higher rate of certain stresses or adversities. We've seen lots of evidence related to increases in domestic abuse, child maltreatment, exploitation. The National Sexual Abuse Hotline reported 22% more calls, half of all coming from minors. That was just in March, right when this was started. So there's other instances of family separation, people not being able to see their loved ones, even parents that are divorced and they can't go back and forth the way they normally would. People are not able to grieve and go through their bereavement process as they normally would. So again, there's a lot of potential for more stressors and adversities than what was already occurring before. Not to mention a lot of issues around inequality, inequity, poverty, economic gaps have been exacerbated. I found this very interesting study too, that was somewhat upsetting, but they looked at 80 studies on loneliness and social isolation. And again, this was put out over the summer in relation to COVID. And they found that the duration of isolation is more predictive of negative outcomes than the intensity of that isolation. Meaning that the longer someone is isolated from others in any social context, the worse outcomes they have. And the fact that the duration of what we're experiencing now, and again, this is going to differ somewhat depending on your community and how you're handling it, that can have a significant impact. And it can be predictive of a range of negative mental health outcomes up to 9 years later. So, a big question I've been asking is, how do we help our students feel less lonely? How do we help them feel less isolated, even in a virtual setting? I can say with my own daughter, I have a 7-year-old and an almost 10-year-old, and it was like June, and we thought things were going fine. I mean, we have a comfortable home. We have many of the comforts that many don't have. And I heard her sobbing in her room one night, and I went up and I said, "What's wrong?" And she just said, "I'm lonely. I miss grandma and grandpa. I miss my friends at school." And it came out of nowhere to me, yet it didn't. And so it was just building up and building up and building up without any external signs until one day it just appeared like that in an observable symptom to me. When I write here, reduced access to stable networks of support, this is one thing that you find in the research around a collective trauma, this idea that the entire community, the entire world is experiencing something. When something happens to you personally, in your personal life or even in a small circle, you can rely on the supports of the people around you that have resources to give. And in this case, many times the people we would normally lean on to give us the emotional resources that we need to recover do not have emotional resources to give themselves. And so while there's some evidence that in some collective experiences that are collectively stressful, there's this sense of we're in this together. We're not feeling that right now because there's a lot of differing opinions on how to handle this, but also we lack access to that stable network of supports. And so, and many times the school ends up being that hub of where people are looking for those supports. And in some cases, us as educators are lacking the emotional supports and the emotional resources we normally have. And so a big part, of course, around this is having the systems that enable our well-being and enable us to maintain those emotional resources the best we can. So now, want to be sure we have a shared understanding about defining trauma-informed, what trauma-informed means. This is a term that's used somewhat regularly. We talk about it all the time. Now, SAMHSA defined it with these 4 components, right? Realizing, recognizing, responding, and then seeking to actively resist re-traumatization. I mean, if you could break this down, it's really awareness of impact and signs, being responsive and doing something about it, and then engaging in prevention and resisting re-traumatization. A lot of the work around trauma-informed schools has focused on the first 2 for a really long time, building this awareness, having an understanding about the impact of negative experiences in our environment and in our world, and how that leads to negative outcomes among students sometimes, and what we can look for. But knowing how to prevent it, knowing how to respond to it is an area where we're still growing and learning. This idea about avoiding re-traumatizing, of course, is very important as it highlights the potential for our schools alone to create a context of adversity and potential trauma. And again, I mentioned this before, but that could be through our inequitable disciplinary practices or our processes for live action, safety drills, or simply a school climate that regularly triggers the stress response among some students. But generally, when we talk about trauma-informed, we talk about a trauma-informed school. It largely represents a perspective shift for many. It's a framework in which we approach the students and families we work with. How do we make them feel safe and loved, capable and likable? How do we build in the hypothesis that maybe what we're seeing is a result or a response to students' background and their history? And perhaps what we're seeing is even an adaptive response to their own environment. So we want to make sure that our schools are protected spaces that foster resilient recovery and adaptive growth, and allow them to focus on the developmental tasks and acquire their developmental competencies. So this resource here, the shapesystem.com, this is one of my favorite kind of whole school assessments for trauma-informed approaches. It's totally free. I derive no personal or financial gain from this. I've just seen many, and this is my favorite. It's also free, which I love. But what they did was they used a consensus process to identify what are the core elements of a trauma-informed school. And as you can see here, 6 out of those 8 components are tier 1. And so, you know, being trauma-informed means that this is a systems level approach. And you know, what I like about this assessment tool is that you can take it individually or a group, or you can assign everyone in your school to take it individually, and it aggregates the data for you. So it's a great resource if you are interested. But just one of my favorite quotes here is that when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. So what does this mean in practical terms? And I know my co-presenters, Dr. Bateman and Dr. Smith, will be covering this in just a few moments. But in practical terms, trauma-informed school means we're looking at, you know, some of these various components. We need to look at our discipline policies, right? So discipline approaches, we need to move from a punishment menu to discipline with a focus on internalized motivation, to develop skill, to be able to regulate behavior on our own. You know, this idea of self-discipline. So one example I gave, and I took the slide off because I wasn't sure if I'd have time to talk about it. but there was this photo that a teacher shared of a student on a Zoom meeting, and they shared it on social media, and all the students' faces were there that they blocked out. And this one it was just a black screen where the name in white, where, you know, if you type in your name but you don't share your video, but it said reconnecting. And the only reason the teacher knew that the student put reconnecting is because they spelled reconnecting wrong, but it's like reconnecting ... And the student didn't spell it wrong. There would be no way to really know that the student was clever enough to put reconnecting as their name, and it looks like they're just having internet issues. Now, many schools we're seeing right now are suspending students, punishing students for not participating or turning on their camera. I've seen some districts, not necessarily in Pennsylvania, but some districts have said students are not allowed to have anything on their desk at home or the table or they're at, except for their computer and a paper and a pencil. If they have anything else, they can get in trouble for it. And so this is making many assumptions, and even just thinking about those processes, and you know, is not really trauma informed. So many times we need to think about how are we supporting students and not just having a focus on punishment and compliance. We need to think about our safety and crisis planning, family engagement and collaboration. Family engagement is so important. Again, the mental wellness of families and the degree to which they feel connected and supported is highly correlated with students' well-being and their student engagement in school. So if we are not actively thinking about the families, their degree of stress, we know that many times when we're reaching out to families, there's data that a lot of the procedural safeguards we send are usually at a college or higher reading level. We invite them to meetings that are extremely intimidating. So the degree to which we can think about how are we engaging and collaborating with families in a more effective way. We need to think about our service delivery and access to services. So one example is trauma-informed IEPs, which is a project Dr. Bateman and I worked on. And it's a book from LRP that just came out in April. Are we ensuring that students have access to the mental and behavioral health services that they may need? Do we have pathways for them right now when otherwise they may be able to knock on the door of that professional in the school building? A big part is skill development. Are we thinking about what are the social and emotional skills that students need to be able to respond to the stress experiences in their lives? Are we focusing on building self-regulatory skills, self-awareness, social awareness? Think about the school environment. What are the cues just within the architecture of the school, the lighting, access to greenery and photos and color? So again, a range of different components here. At this point, I will end there. I want to thank you for the time you gave me today. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, and I will turn it over to my colleagues.
Well, great. So it's my turn next, folks. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to get a audio update from Sarah or somebody that says that, yes, they can see my screen.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. And so, first of all, that was awesome, Eric. That was just great. I was scribbling notes as we went along. And first of all, to our captionists, I hope I can maintain that same pace. Oftentimes, I tend to go a little bit faster. And for the rest of us, if you were with us in August, we talked a little bit about engagement, and Eric was talking about engagement as he was finishing up. And I want to kind of piggyback on that. And in a way, back in August, and if you weren't with us in August, I'm going to give you a resource in just a moment, but we were asking a series of questions about engagement. And of course, they continue to pop up. Some now have evolved into other types of questions. But at the end of the day, what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of offer an update from where we were back in August, And by the way, I have a resource here, and this is a clickable slide. And Sarah and others from Patton will get you the link. This is a Google slide that I'm presenting on today. And of course, I had a group of Google slides. And I emphasize that because a number of different apps, a number of different resources were shared back in August about this idea of engagement. They're still very valid, and I hope they're very helpful in where we are today. And as we are, I know many of us very, very busy in lots of different types of educational settings that we're trying to offer. So anyways, I want to refer to those because what I want to do today in our update and our kind of continuous thinking is reinforce some things and offer some things as we've been progressing that I believe are very, very relevant for all of us. And with the realization that there is no magic pill in what we're trying to do in terms of trying to engage our learners. And also the fact that we are all working in a variety of different settings. And I know Pennsylvania, of course, like many other states, including here in the Midwest, we're pivoting. We're pivoting from a variety of different settings. And so with that said, I know I'm speaking to folks that are fortunate potentially enough to be face-to-face or are fully online, and that's a fortunate thing as well, or hybrid or a mix of things. And with that, I want to touch upon a number of different ideas for us when we think about engagement in that respect. So first start, I'm going to review a bit from when we met in August. For those of us that weren't here in August, I believe that engagement comes down to planning and designing. In December, you're going to have a colleague of ours from the University of Hawaii share phenomenal resources on planning and designing with the Universal Design for Learning framework. Now, for those of us familiar with the framework, great. For those of us not, I only mention it because that green row is all about engagement. And the Universal Design for Learning framework, whether or not you're familiar with it or not, is something I'm going to reinforce as a suggestion to think to as a guide for our engagement. It breaks things down, it gives ideas, it gives steps, starting with we recruit interest, ending with we want students to self-regulate, and it gives suggestions. For example, in terms of the UDL framework and engagement, and by the way, those bicycles are to represent, in a way, we're doing a lot of pedaling initially. We want those students to be on their own 10 speeds to facilitate things from there. But some practical tips are the fact that, hey, everything from creating clear, specific goals to incorporating authentic and relevant examples, these are standbys for engagement that, again, we reinforced in August. I want to reinforce again, I'm not spending enough time on these. This is off the Google slide, but I want to reinforce that we're not recreating the engagement aspect when it comes to COVID. Instead, there's a lot of ideas, a lot of principles. There's some frameworks to offer ways to facilitate that and combine those things as we try to further facilitate engagement of the students we're serving as well as the stakeholders we're interacting with. So with that said, and by the way, this is a screenshot of some of the thorough things you'll receive once you go to the UDL CAST website, which I've hyperlinked again off this slideshow. So with that in mind, I wanted to kind of review in my limited time with you today, just a few ideas when we're thinking about how to foster and maximize that engagement, regardless of the type of educational hybrid, face-to-face, fully online, virtual, whatever that we're doing. And I want to go back to our learning management system or our primary digital tools. Now, as a reminder, our learning management system is going to be what? Google Classroom, Blackboard, Canvas, PowerSchool, Seesaw, the list goes on. It may be a series of digital tools you're using, and you may be fully face-to-face, but remember, many of us, I don't have to make folks that are teaching face-to-face recall this, we're dealing with masks, we're dealing with social distancing, we're dealing with obligations that are requiring us to also foster and support, particularly for struggling learners, some resources that are also online. And why? Because we're not having the time and the exposure and the amount of reinforcement, et cetera, that we traditionally would have due to all these other complicating factors. So to me, using our digital resources, or hopefully that learning management system our building or our district has adopted, and out here in the Midwest, a lot of districts have invested in a certain type of, be it the elementary level, middle school, and secondary level. But those have features built in, check-in features, exit ticket features built in, two-way communications and conversations built into the LMS. They're automatically there. And I know many of us are using those, and I just reinforce using those at a very optimal way to give that connection to our students, because open communication is a great way to engage. They feel connected. They feel they're being heard. They feel they're being understood. They feel that they're not alone, even though they may be there, but we're there physically with them. But again, we're masked and all that type of stuff. That connection, that further reinforcement. And remember, this is very much aligned with universal design for learning. The fact that we're maximizing that in terms of the number of options we're giving. Now, with that said, to me, there's several different ways to think about this, and structuring the communication is one. And when I talk about structuring the communication, I'm talking about the fact that we can offer suggestions to our students, be it forms that we create, be it forms that we create for check-in and check-outs, be it visuals that we're asking them to utilize to structure some of that communication, be it forms that we provide the parent and the caregivers at home to ask them questions that then they would answer to give us the type of information we want to better understand that communication, to again, better engage the students that we're serving. All right, in addition to that, next, we also want to think about that personalized learning. That personalized learning gives us another framework to really think about how to maximize student engagement. It's phenomenal, it's been out there for years. And again, a lot of this is common sense, but to me, common sense, but again, much more practical. So for example, to begin with, we're going to use that formative feedback. And if you've been with us in the past, we talked about a key to formative feedback, and that the fact that there's tools for that just in time. There's the automatic feedback that we can build in our design, back to that design component. And why is that necessary for engagement? Those students are connected. The students see the fact that, oh, okay, yeah, I'm moving along the path I should be. Oh, I need that self-correction. Oh, I did that right. I'm moving along. This is good. The database decision, those types of elements all factor into that further connectivity for engagement. And of course, those regular opportunities for feedback can be offered in a number of different digital solutions, including just in time. I'm watching the student complete it, be it in a Google type of environment, where I can offer that feedback right then and there, and they're seeing it synchronously or potentially asynchronously. Lots of digital tools that do that, not just one. There's so many out there, and I know many of us are using those, and it's just maximizing that feature. You know, the way I see this is I see this personalized learning, but I think of it from a special educator perspective. And that is, if I'm interacting with a child face-to-face, I've known for years, students with disabilities, they need support with the transitions. And what I mean by that is, as many of us know, it's not only prepping for the transition, it's not only guiding them with visuals, it's not only guiding them with verbals, it's not only prompting them physically that, hey, we're about to come into a transition. And we do it, as we know, to reduce behavior. We do it to be able to get them prepared and for us to facilitate what they need for that preparation. But another element that we know in transitions is that when the transition is complete and we're moving on to the next component, be it that we physically have done something or we're going from one instructional experience to another, we need to show the child that they're actually complete. There's been success. We now need to move to the next step. If we don't, that oftentimes in our transition process creates a lot of challenge. We see it from a behavioral, from a communication perspective. So why wouldn't we, with the digital supports we have, do the same thing and allowing the student to recognize from a personalized perspective that closure? That's going to enhance that engagement as well. Next in this process, of course, back to that personalized learning, we need to plan for a lot of the pathways we can create. I know many of us are doing this. Now, I know it takes a lot of time, and yet with the digital tools we have available to us, we can create something and then provide multiple paths depending upon the individual with literally just the way we set it up. So we can do this in Google Classroom, we can do this in Seesaw and IXL, but as we know, many of these tools we're using, like Khan Academy, they have preset plans already in place. It would be us just creating those and structuring those for the groups of students that we're working with. Unique Learning Systems does this quite well for individuals with intellectual disabilities when it comes to reading. But it also allows us, back to that rubric that we talked about with assessment a while back, to be able to allow that flexibility, but also guide the student with the expectations. Yes, easier for us to grade, but also align for those options and that guidance mechanism, which is really, really key. And that furthering that personalized, which is furthering that engagement level for the individual that we're serving. We also need to think about ourselves as a coach. Now, many of us are benefiting from the instructional coaches in our district. Maybe some of us are engaged in the virtual coaching, and we're doing some virtual coaching work, and it's phenomenal. I really think it's going to alter the way we support teachers. But now I'm thinking more for us as the coach to support the student. And so we need to be that master facilitator. We need to create the experience, map it out for the individual. And in doing so, we're creating it for that face-to-face, for that prompts, for the time we have where we're going to provide that explicit direct instruction, and then realizing we're also, as we already are doing, carving out how we're supporting that in the online digital world. And we're operationalizing those options. So the individual can see what they're learning. The individual can see the feedback that we're providing that we've built into that. The individuals see that they're completing, as we mentioned a moment ago. They're seeing the fact that we're allowing them to focus in on their interests and allowing them to maximize that. That they see choices, and we've developed those choices because we're trying to give them multiple paths. And we're communicating those, and we're doing those not only for face-to-face, but also for the home and school, the home environment. And again, we're doing this also to facilitate our role and increasingly a change in their role in the learning process, which we're going to get to more towards that self-regulation. These are all key options to engage. And I know I'm a bit of 100 feet in the air here, but I'm trying to reinforce some elements that many of us are already taking to heart. And again, reinforcing them with some of the resources we talked about back in August. The other element that's so key here to me is that engagement of the caregiver and the parent. Now, Eric was mentioning that towards his closure as well, about how it's so important to engage. And I know many of us have probably already finished our first quarter or first trimester interactions with our parents. I was talking to one of my sisters who's a teacher just south of you folks in Virginia, and how she was holding traditional, and she's teaching face-to-face, and she's holding these traditional parent conferences. And yet she's also doing a lot of virtual office hours and a lot of weekly interconnections, and it's really altered this quarterly, I think it's quarterly for her, this quarterly connection, which the building's still holding, but for her, this so old, it's such an old way of doing things, because she's operationalized this communication between school, home, school, everything from, she's created processes to facilitate the communication. She's created ways and questions that the educator, the parents are asking of her, and then she's created Q&As within her digital classroom environment. And again, she's fully face-to-face. She's provided directions and instructions, not only for her students to mimic what she's providing face-to-face, but also to the caregivers serving those students. So they're able to, in a way, be right there and understanding, in a way, what she's conveyed to them. They're seeing video of that in other directions. And overall, she's trying to foster, and we need to foster, this idea of collaboration, not consultation, with their parent and caregivers. You know, that consultant is, I'm the expert, I'm going to share with you what you know, what I know, now you go do it. Where that collaborative is a much more shared responsibility. There's much more parity in some of what we're trying to do. And that's where, if we're more of a coach and more of a facilitator in these processes, we're going to foster further engagement of the individuals we're serving because of that empowerment. And by the way, we can do the same thing with the student in terms of engaging them so they can problem solve and give you the skills that we'll talk about in just a moment to further engage them in that learning process. All right, just a few more things, and then I'm going to give my time to David, but also that self-regulation. And I kind of referred to this in this presentation today. And I know many of us are already working on this, and it's like, yeah, sure, but where are we finding time? And I know that's difficult, but the investment in trying to develop those skills. So everything from setting goals and allowing the individual to be part of that process in setting goals, but also the relationship to the goals, the fact that now what are they? And of course, we're going to provide them in text and visuals and things of that nature, but ways to achieve. And then we're going to make certain that we're offering opportunities to measure that achievement to further engage. I'm seeing now that I have a personalized goal. I'm seeing now that I have a connection to that. I'm seeing that I'm moving forward to it. I'm seeing that I actually have success in it. But other self-regulation components, organizers that not only are we going to use, but we're going to develop skills to be able to use them. We're going to teach specific strategies. We're going to use those strategies. We're going to embed those strategies. In my way, using a lot of different digital tools to facilitate that. And by the way, Understood is a great resource. It's hyperlinked there that walks you through a number of different ways to teach self-regulated skills to individuals. And finally, options, options, options. Options for the fact that, okay, I have some students that don't really want to have the camera on, that practical thing. But in so doing, okay, well, here are other ways to participate. And here are other ways that facilitate what could be happening at home if we're in a virtual environment. And we're providing that to the stakeholders. And I know many of us are already doing it. But to me, we're going to ramp up those options. Maybe over the winter break when we have a little bit more time to gather our sorts and catch a deep breath. But we're also going to give options in terms of materials and strategies and resources. And I know many of us are already there, and we're building upon those, realizing these are not just resources for COVID and the pandemic, but these are resources that we'll be utilizing much more beyond because of the ways it empowers, further engages, et cetera. And finally, David, this is your cue, my last slide. We're going to make sure that we provide things for our learners that are relevant, that we connect to their student interests, their lives, their environments, their experiences. We're going to make it authentic, real world experiences. And of course, these are engagement ideas that have been around for years. We're going to collaborate. We're going to facilitate ways that they can work together. And I talked about that last time we visited, and I have a hyperlink again to that presentation about a number of different tools that allow students to collaborate asynchronously and synchronously to allow them to be further empowered and further engaged. We're going to embed prompts so that they have self-checks, so that there's a level of independence, and that level of independence will lead to a level of engagement in that I'm not relying on another individual. I can complete this, I can move on, and I can do things of my interest and achieve my goals. And we're going to do this through a variety of different types of, embedded LMS systems like Google Classroom and other digital components. And finally, we'll facilitate this interaction with peers, because peers can offer in terms of collaboration. Peers can be checks, peers can be supports in that self-regulation process. A lot more, again, a number of resources, they're still available off that August presentation. And I hope it got us thinking a little bit more about ways to engage for our individuals that we're trying to facilitate, be it face-to-face, hybrid, or fully online. And I'll stop sharing, David, and time for you.
Thanks, I appreciate the heads up. That was your last slide. That helped me stay awake. It just kind of kicked me into gear as I'm trying just to get positioned here and things like this. So I'm going to share my screen because that's what we do as a part of this. And I appreciate following the wonderful presentations we just had from Dr. Rossen and Dr. Smith. But I'm just going to share some things that I have just come up learned about just in the past few weeks. As I've been talking to districts across the state, I think I've talked to only about 7 districts today, about another 8 different yesterday, is that basically teachers are stressed. Teachers and staff are stressed and they're unsure about what they need to do. Many of the districts are, as COVID numbers have been increasing rather dramatically across the state, many of the districts are making decisions about what they should be doing and how we should be doing.
Hey everybody, we're living in a Zoom world. It looks like Dr. Bateman's having just a minor technical difficulty. So it looks like he's going to maybe try to turn off his camera and turn it back on and reconnect with us. But as he's doing that, thank you for those of you that have kind of thrown some questions maybe to us in the Q&A tool. We put those in there, and also we've got the shared notes doc up there, and I think Eric may have some things that he'd like to weigh in on this too, as hopefully Dr. Bateman comes back online with us. Eric?
Sure, yeah, so I'm pulling up some information I have here. I will say this because I'm so glad that we are covering the fact that teachers and staff are really stressed. I can say I have examples of some of the Facebook groups just in the districts where I live and the neighboring districts where people are calling teachers lazy and snowflakes, and they're saying, oh, well, this is what the union is for. And it's so unfair. And teachers are working so incredibly hard. And oftentimes just hearing that kind of negative feedback in the social media world without feeling totally appreciated, the structure and function of your role sometimes have changed. People have moved around grades. You're asked to do something very differently than what you've done in the past. And so all these things are incredibly challenging. And when I shared my slide before that shared those 8 elements, that was from that the shape system. Remember, one of those 8 elements, I don't know if you caught that, was staff self-care. For me, I tend to stay away from the term self-care when thinking about this broadly. I think staff self-care is a component of thinking more about staff well-being. And here's why I choose those terms very carefully. When I think about staff self-care, and when I've sat in presentations myself for staff self-care, there are times when I feel like it's an added obligation and responsibility on top of the many things I have. And that the environment sometimes is not enabling me to do those things well. And an example that's often given is this idea of boundary setting. This idea where, you know, don't email on weekends, for example. And now I can say that I can set that goal personally. I can try to set that boundary as a measure of self-care. However, I'm sometimes left with this feeling like I need to be checking email because everyone else is sending an email. But if there is an administrator that comes in and says, as a system, we are all agreeing that we are not going to send emails on the weekend. If you want to send emails on the weekend because it makes you feel better, that's great, but don't expect anyone on staff to respond. That would enable me and free me to actually say I'm not going to email because I know this is an expectation. And so this is what I mean when there are system level components that enable you to actually promote well-being versus actually just thinking about self-care alone. So I see that Dave is no longer sharing the screen. So I'm actually going to try and find some slides on this. So just give me a brief moment. Okay. So, all right, so I'm going to share actually some slides that I did for the National Association of School Psychologists, which is where I work. Can you see those?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So this is just one example here that there was a sample of teachers in Maine. And if you can guess what the answer was, how many report at least 4 out of 10 ACEs on the ACE screener? And again, the ACE is incomplete, but it is a good indicator of potential risk. The answer was D. And this is prior to COVID. So we have teachers that are already stressed. We have staff that are experiencing additional stress on top of coming in with additional concerns. And so when we think about secondary traumatic stress, there's many indicators of what this might look like. So we might have physical indicators or personal indicators or workplace indicators. Workplace indicators are even things like, you know, you don't want to come to work. You're feeling unproductive. You're feeling completely unmotivated. So as I said, the idea of staff well-being should be a tier 1 initiative. So some of the research shows that some components are just having access to peer support. Opportunities and proactive structured opportunities where people and the staff can get to know each other, where they like each other. They don't necessarily even have to like each other, but they learn to tolerate each other. There's a lot of data that show that even just given the ability to talk to fellow staff members and colleagues about stress, about secondary trauma, which refers to a term of experiencing stress and compassion fatigue from helping others that are stressed. That just that peer support can be really meaningful and mitigate a lot of the symptoms of that post-traumatic or that secondary traumatic stress. This idea of induction or mentor or peer pairing. Induction programs are things where, you know, any incoming or new or first or second year staff, there is a structured process where they're assigned a mentor. And this doesn't have to be highly structured as much as far as how their meetings go, but that there's someone that they know that they can go to and talk to. We know that secondary traumatic stress among staff is more likely in early career new staff. And imagine being a new staff last year or this year. And this is, I mean, it's hard enough being a teacher for the first time or in any role in education. And in these circumstances where we probably weren't adequately prepared. Administrator recognition is also extremely critical. The idea that they're acknowledging it, they're reducing stigma. I've heard of, and I think Dr. Smith was talking about this idea of office hours to allow for direct communication with district staff. I think he was talking about with family engagement. We can do that internally as well. So some school-wide efforts that address secondary traumatic stress and that address staff well-being. This idea of having pinch hitters and an adequate substitute pool, or the idea of buddy classrooms. The idea of a shout-out wall for staff. I often say, you know, this idea that we're acknowledging each other, we're rewarding each other. I don't know if anyone watched The Office, but you know, they have the Dundees. We should acknowledge each other. We should reward each other. We should recognize each other. And doing just a simple shout out wall where people can just say, great job on this. Thank you for stepping up and helping out when I had to, you know, step out of the classroom for 15 minutes. Thanks to Principal so-and-so for being such a great leader. Thanks to this person for helping set up my Zoom meeting when I couldn't figure it out on my own. Whatever that might be. The idea that we're acknowledging and creating an environment where our successes are shared, and that we, a lot of times when we're so isolated, it's hard to know that what we're doing is having an impact. I can say my daughter that's in second grade, her teacher lives down the street from us, which is a nice thing, and we don't bother her, but we run into her sometimes. And my wife and I were walking and we saw her the other day, and the first thing she said was, is Nora doing okay? Is she having a good time at school? You know, it's just so hard for me to know. And I realized like how she's working so hard and she's not getting that kind of feedback, and she doesn't feel validated. She doesn't feel secure because she's had to change what she's doing. And so having that acknowledgement can really go a long way. So this is an example about what one school did as a gratitude or shout out wall. They used Padlet, which is a free website where you can actually create just basically a virtual bulletin board. And if you look closely, you know, one person wrote, you know, I'm grateful for Miss Ellen. She always got my back and takes very good care of the students and me. Thank you, Miss Ellen. Maybe this is something you want to do for your students too. So it's padlet.com, again, totally free, really simple to use. This is an example from a principal in Tennessee. He uses a tap in, tap out system. He uses the free GroupMe app, and you can see these are actual screenshots where someone said, I need to tap out ASAP. And one person writes, I can come. And another person writes OTW, which means on the way. And they've basically created a system where people need to step out for 10 minutes. They're feeling dysregulated themselves, and they don't want to be in a position where they're going to yell or engage in some kind of power struggle with a student that would be highly unproductive. Again, maybe they got an important call from their doctor that they need to take, or they just learned some bad news, whatever that might be. It creates a system where you feel like you're supported. And again, these are, again, systemic features. These are not things that rely on you engaging in self-care alone. So I'm sharing this here, some boundary setting activities. And one thing I always like to suggest is think about setting boundaries. And sometimes that means you're doing it as a staff, and whether you're doing it as a team, right? Maybe your grade level team, maybe your, your team of special educators, maybe it's the whole school. But you actually sit down and answer some questions and you come to agreements. So you're not trying to come up with these boundaries on your own. So I have a few questions here. These again are, you can make up your own. These are ones for the school. And then I have a bunch here. These are examples, and I can share some of these because I know I wasn't preparing to do these slides, and so I didn't share them ahead of time. But I can share these. These are questions you can also talk about regarding your connections with students. Right now, is it okay to transport students in your car? Is it okay to make home visits? Can we provide personal items that students may need? What is the boundary there, right? Can we hug students? What do we do with students' records? Do we take them home on weekends if we're working on our reports, or is that frowned upon? There are both legal issues as well as issues around our well-being and creating those boundaries. Resource mapping is another great thing to do. This is one tool I particularly like. Resource mapping can be really useful if you are thinking about, especially if you're in a large or a small district, but large district, you can think about, well, how are we mobilizing the resources within our district right now to make sure they're being sent where they're needed. So when we're thinking about our commitment to self-care, self-care means a lot of different things. I'm going to skip here, but I want to be sure that I say that self-care is not these things. Self-care is not simply indulgent behavior, and it's also not hard to access. So self-care, and again, I want to go back to this idea that I think staff well-being is a tier 1 issue that needs to be prioritized. But taking care of yourself is also a personal responsibility. So it can't be hard to access. So you can't say, well, it's either eating a lot of bad food for me that's bad for my overall health, or it requires a vacation that is hard to access. The idea is, what are self-care components that can be built into your life? Maybe that's surrounding yourself with good fragrances and greenery in your house and playing music in the background while you're teaching or while you're grading. Or maybe you're building in a regular schedule to just touch base with your colleagues. So again, it's really restructuring how we're thinking about how are we supporting staff and each other. So I know we're sort of out of time here, but I'll stop sharing. I'll turn it over to Sarah and Ethan here.
Thank you again, Eric. And somebody had commented like, wow, what a great example of modeling behavior there. You tapped in very seamlessly to help out with our technology issues. We do want to be respectful.
I'm going to make Dr. Bateman pay for that one. He owes me lunch.
It's going to be like a barter board, more like a shout out board, right?
That's right, exactly.
trading favors. We do want to be mindful of folks' time, and we understand if folks need to kind of get out the door, whether that's just virtually in Zoom or you are transitioning with an afternoon commute. So the attendance form is now open and available. If you are rushing out the door, and you need to just like take a screen grab or say, it's also in the shared link. The attendance form is accessible until midnight. So you've got several hours to do it. Just make sure you do the attendance form today. We know that UDL was featured. That was kind of one of those like the password is moments from today's webinar. Join us in December, as Dr. Smith previewed. We'll have a special hour of considerations for digital tools and instructional strategies and resources using that UDL framework, hopefully to give you some great ideas to carry you over the winter break and into the next semester or the start of the new year with your classes. Dr. Bateman is back on the line with us. I'm not sure what his schedule and availability is. He's always a gentleman. I'm sure we will definitely add his slides and as resources to the shared notes. But if you've got the time, David, and you want to share, we'll keep this party going. But I just wanted to be mindful of participants who may need to have a hard stop at the 4 o'clock hour. So if you need to do,
so when did my internet kick out? So
oh, right on the very first screen. We got nothing. So again, participants attendance form, if you need to head out, go for it. Dr. Bateman, or if there are a few things that you'd like to touch on before we close out, I invite you to. I just don't want any participants to feel as though they're kind of locked into the room per se. We will make sure, absolutely, this whole session is being recorded, and we will share the video and audio recording as well as the slides and the resources. But yeah, we don't want to miss out on the opportunity to hear from you live if you're available.
well, I think I can share in about 2 minutes what's going on. And what I really want to pay attention to, the slides are fairly self-explanatory, but what I really want to emphasize, and I appreciate Eric stepping in. My internet went down and just kicked back in. I have no idea what happened. Maybe I didn't pay the gerbils enough to run what's going on. But what's interesting about this is the concern that I'm having is that teachers are feeling really stressed. And so in order for us to be able to provide appropriate services for kids eligible for special education and related services, we need to watch ourselves. We absolutely need to watch ourselves and make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and we're getting our needs addressed. So for district administrators, monitor the mental health of your faculty. Make sure that they're getting supports, because not everyone is experiencing this, as has been articulated very nicely. Not everyone is experiencing the COVID shutdowns in the same manner. There are individuals who are having to provide instruction to their kids, as well as provide instruction to others. And we have many balls in the air, and some of these things are just getting dropped. So what we have to do is make sure that you're providing some appropriate services to yourself. If there's one thing that I want you to take a walk, watch your health, watch what you're eating, stay connected with your peers, but make sure what you're doing is making sure that you can continue to provide appropriate service to the kids. Because if you're not watching yourself, you're not going to be able to do this. So that's a very quick summary there, Sarah. So just kind of talk about this. And again, I apologize about the internet here. I blame Comcast completely and totally. So, yes.
And I think, to your point, Dr. Bateman, and I think the others would weigh in, is there's no need to apologize. Those are the realities that we're all living with, today and in virtual land. And it is the silver lining is that everybody was empathetic, and both the participants and the fellow panelists modeled what we would hope would happen. And we know that this has happened for our teachers across the Commonwealth, right? There's no way to expect things like that, and just being able to kind of breathe a sigh of relief and know that everybody's got your back and people are understanding. I think that's, if we needed to have one major takeaway out of the session, wow, you all hit it for us without even knowing that that's what we were going to get out of it. So thank you. And I know Dr. Smith had to step away for another meeting or appointment, so he's not with us to close out, but we want to say, give him a shout out as well. Thank you to Dr. Smith, and thank you to our other panelists. There are a few questions that were asked in the Q&A tool that we've been trying to keep up with throughout this time. As always, if you have questions as a follow-up, we encourage you to reach out to us through email, or you're always welcome to see us for our technical assistance drop-in office hours. So if you want to hang out with us in Zoom some more, we'll be back in Zoom on Tuesday afternoon. If you'd like to talk through some of the resources like Padlet that Eric mentioned, or anything else, we've got the time to do that then as well. Any closing words from our panelists?
No, go enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.
But also, thank you, very nicely stated, but also thank you for your service. We really appreciate what you're trying to do in providing services to kids with disabilities, and that you are here, and we really do. You guys don't hear enough, but we really do appreciate it.
Agreed.
That's the best way to end today's hour. Enjoy your afternoon, and just know that you are valued and appreciated. We'll see you again soon.